Just to make sure everyone's in the right room, this is the local land use planning and forest economy breakout session for the afternoon. So thanks everybody for coming today. Bathrooms are downstairs if anyone needs them, if no one's figured that out yet.
Actually, there's one right here in the corner.
Never mind, there's one right here in the corner, even closer, so.
Closer to the bar.
That's even more important today. You can sneak right through there as well, but not for another 90 minutes. So as I said, I should start by saying my name is Charlie Hancock. I'm a consulting forester based out of Montgomery, or across northern tier of the state. I'm also the chairman of the Montgomery Select Board. I mentioned that in the context of the work we do at a local level around land use planning. Because this conversation we're going to have today is going to scale all the way up to state regional policy and all the way down to local things, whether regulatory or non-regulatory. So we're going to kind of span the gamut there. But today's conversation, and it's really going to be a conversation. We want to engage everybody in this. This is not going to be one of those sessions where we put a PowerPoint up and we walk through it and then have questions at the end and say, what don't you understand, right? So today we're hoping to really engage everybody, as well as a great panel that we have up here. And the point of today is that I hope folks are all aware that we recently developed and launched the Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. Came out this spring. One of the pillars, pillar one, is around forest management and land use, which promotes the working forests and land use planning. So the idea there is to promote legislation and land use planning that recognizes the value of maintaining intact and connected forests, promoting sustainable forest management, and support for forest products enterprises. And so today is really, our goal is to start this conversation by bringing together essentially non-traditional partners to talk about what this means in the context of what we do every day in our lives. And I really want to highlight the non-traditional partners aspect of this, because if we're going to have success in this industry, especially around this topic, we're going to have to kind of build diverse coalitions and create new partnerships that we haven't in the past. And so to that end, I want to introduce our panel up here. Jamey Fidel with the Vermont Natural Resources Council. We have Colleen Goodrich, owner of Goodrich Lumber, which just celebrated its 50th year in operation. So I think we should give Colleen Catherine Dimitri from Northwoods Regional Planning Commission, and Josh Hanford, who is the Director of Intergovernmental Relations at the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. It's super cool because I don't think we've ever had any representation from regional planning commissions at the Forest Industry Summit or the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. So again, thinking about non-traditional partners, building coalitions, and again, having a conversation. So today, the goal isn't to come out of here with some fully baked policy platform. I don't think anybody up here has any solutions that they're going to come down and bestow upon us, tablets from Mount Sinai or whatever. It's about starting a conversation, putting it all up on the wall, see what looks to stick, see if there are areas of consensus that are developing, and then figuring out, is there something here that we can move forward with? I also want to make a really quick plug that anytime we talk about land use policy, we can drift into areas where there's potentially differences in opinion around policy or things at a broader level around philosophical things around private property ownership, things like that. Today, I'm hoping to not really dig into too many of those things that could be, those kinds of things that would kind of drive us apart, if that's the right way to put it, and really focus on those areas where there is consensus. And I say that acknowledging that, not everyone in this room or everybody at this meeting today is ever going to agree on everything, but today we want to kind of focus on those nuggets where there might be consensus developing. So again, what we're hoping to do today is have a conversation. I've got some guiding questions that I'm going to kind of pose to the panel here to kind of chew on. And then as we go, we're going to open it up to the room for folks to basically ask questions or throw out ideas based on your experience, what you're seeing. I know everybody here is involved in the forest products economy, but all of us wear different hats too. I know at least some of you are on local commissions. A lot of you have worked in legislature on things like this. So we have a really deep bench experience in the room that I'm really hoping we can draw on today. I believe this is being recorded too, and so just to be clear, it is being recorded. But the benefit there is that we can go back through this later and actually tease out, what was that thing that Ed said that we really wanted to jump onto, and kind of tease those ideas out. And so ideally what we can do is kind of do that kind of collective synthesis, and then hopefully do kind of a report back out to say, hey, here's what we thought, and folks can reflect on that. So that's kind of the introduction for today's conversation. And I'm going to launch right into it since we only have 90 minutes. And I want to start by thinking about situational awareness. You know, what's happening right now in this area of land use planning. A lot came out of this past session. Things going back a number of sessions, going back to Act 171. And also thinking again at that local level in our towns, in our own communities, and then zooming way back out, looking at state level or even regional policies. So, situational awareness, what do you see in recent state and policy legislation aimed at addressing the issues on the table here? Zoom in, zoom out. Jamey, I want to start with you. So, what do you see going on?
So there was a lot of attention to this issue. I mean, I'm guessing some, if not a lot of you are aware that there was a really large conversation this year about how to reform Act 250, and that was combined with a discussion about how to address housing crisis and housing policies that are needed. And the goal for the year was not to look at them separately, that the Act 250 work that's been going on for a number of years now, going back, I think even 5 years to sort of Act 250 commission that took a hard look at how to reform Act 250, has been trying to do it comprehensively. So it's looking at a lot of different important issues, from sort of the traditional role of the Act to being an environmental sort of land use review law, to the fact that it does play a role in influencing and impacting how we do housing in Vermont. Natural resource considerations, working lands considerations. There's issues that I know are important to people in the room, but then also working lands considerations on agricultural lands and definitions there. So just a lot that was tackled in several bills that ended up getting combined into 687, which was a pretty ambitious omnibus bill, if that's what you call it, of housing policies. Reformed Act 250. We certainly don't have all the time to get into the details, but I would, highlight that should the bill become law, it was passed by the legislature, it hasn't been sent to the governor yet. Should it become law, then there'll be a couple of provisions in there that I think that would be of interest to this group, and I could quickly just touch on that. One is there was a conversation about what should forest processing or wood manufacturing at a certain level be exempt from Act 250. What the right approach is for that. The way that settled at the end was to have a stakeholder group that really looks at the opportunities to find efficiencies in the permitting program, recognize that it's not just Act 250 permits, there's A&R permits, there's municipal permits. They all can play a certain role in creating cost and potentially delay. So to take a holistic look at the permitting process, try and find efficiencies, or decide is there even an alternative permitting process that can be designed. There was a policy in that bill to lower the mitigation rate for wood manufacture impact, forest processing impacts to prime agricultural soils. So that ratio is now down to 1:1. Which is the same as impacts in industrial areas. There's also attention in the bill to having a functional criteria for forests. So essentially a criteria for forest blocks, and if there's going to be an undue adverse effect from proposed development, to look at ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate those impacts through site design, really with the goal of trying to reduce the overall sort of fragmentation that happens when we have large developments like subdivisions happening in forest lands. And then there's also attention to critical resource areas, which may have a heightened look at as well, but that will go through sort of a rulemaking stakeholder process to decide what are even those areas that would be so important that they should get sort of a higher level of review. And then there's a lot of attention in the bill, and I don't know if you were going to speak to sort of the counterpoint to some of the natural resource protection initiatives is to actually relax Act 250, eliminate it, and designated areas, village centers, areas where there's already a strong underpinning of local land use review. And I'll leave some of that, maybe some of the details, because Catherine may hit on some of that. And were you going to talk maybe about the sort of the role of regional, land use future going? Yeah, because I think there's some interesting points there. So I don't want to take up too much time here, other than to say that there's a lot in the bill, and I think it's sort of the the big ticket item for this year, because there's a lot that would potentially happen in there that would be of interest, I think, to this group as far as opportunity. Charlie hit on this before. There has been already, over the past couple of years, already some changes made in Act 250 to help. So there was more flexibility to hours of operation for facilities as part of the Act 250 process a couple of years ago. That passed. And then going back even further, a number of years ago, there was a change to basically consider most forest processing facilities to be considered going through as a minor versus a major project in Act 250. I've looked at the results of that. It does seem to have resulted in efficiency. I'd be curious through conversation. I know that there's examples of people that feel like that it's still not a smooth process, but what I've seen is there were about 6 facilities that got permitted since that provision was in place, and they were all approved as minors in about 2 to 4 months. A couple took up to about 6 months. So those are a couple changes that have already happened as far as finding some efficiencies or trying to find efficiencies in the Act 250 process. And then maybe when we get to sort of best practices, we can talk about Act 171, and that was a change at the local and regional planning level to sort of raise attention to the important role of forests through that planning process.
Great, thanks, Jamey. Catherine, do you want to speak from your perspective as a regional planning commission and what you're seeing? Can you touch on what Jamey had talked about as far as the changes coming out around Act 250 and some of the planning provisions there, maybe?
Sure. So as Jamey noted it, this bill does become law. There are a number of changes to the regional planning process. All regional planning commissions, all 11 in the state, currently do future plans, and included in that is a future land use plan where we designate areas for development, for agriculture, and it's really a guiding document. It's a guiding future land use plan. H687 would actually bring consistency to that statewide, so every regional plan would use the same land use categories, and we would do it all consistently statewide. And those land use plans would then serve as the foundation for Act 250 jurisdiction in determining the areas that Jamey mentioned, these planned growth areas where there would be little to no Act 250 review, up to potentially some areas where there could be increased review. As part of this consistency, 2 of the land use categories I think are most interest to this group. The first is working lands, and that includes agriculture and forestry, rural working lands, and making sure that those are shown as a priority, that conserving the working nature of those lands for the economy and the people of the region and the state would be the highest priority in those areas. And then there's a conservation zone or conservation area, because it's not zoning, a conservation area that all regional planning commissions may designate, and that includes those areas that are the highest value in the region for either ecological or productivity reasons. An example in our region is we have a conservation area that travels, the whole eastern part of Franklin County in the mountain areas. And where that also comes into play currently is all regional planning commissions do energy plans, and energy plans, if they're done to a certain extent at the regional level, get higher weight in public utility commission reviews. And so because, a great example of how that works is because we've designated this area as a conservation area in our regional plan that says that keeping that forest intact is the highest priority so that it can remain productive for forestry as well as ecological functions. When we did our energy plan, all of the data showed that that's the exact same area where it's the best place to build renewable wind projects. And so because our plan already said it's priority to conserve and protect those lands, our plan says no industrial wind. Because there was a reason for it, there was a basis for it, we relied on the importance of forestry and ecological functions of that forest block.
So, Josh, thinking about this work that we're going to get into with these regional land use plans, the regional planning commissions are going to be a big facilitator for that, but a lot of it will come down to the towns, the individual communities, and what they're seeing and what their objectives are, and, with the VLCT hat on, thinking about municipalities and supporting them. I'm curious, what do you see in this context as far as what municipalities need to be thinking out for?
Yeah, sort of, as you said, Charlie, as a sort of traditional partner in this work, I was thinking about, what's the experience, what's the sort of discussion points, and, my role, my career, right, before working with the league, I was Commissioner of Housing and Community Development. In my sort of volunteer personal life, I had a lot of work with trail organizations, was involved in starting one of the bigger ones in central Vermont, and worked with a lot of private landowners and town forests, communities that owned community forest land. So thinking about this from that perspective and those experiences, first thing that came to mind, and one of the efforts underway to really map and understand where are the parts of our state that are so sensitive, we need to designate them with special importance through this new Act 250 Tier 3 process, through some of the 30 by 30 goal work where, there's a bill passed a year or two ago to look at making sure 30% of the state is permanently conserved by 2030. Another bill that passed this year about river corridors, river corridor protection, flood hazard areas, wetlands, with a goal of trying to ensure we're not continually flooding out the same places, fixing, repairing them. There's potential that there's a lot of land, private property, owned by private ownership. Maybe it has good forest value, maybe it doesn't, but there's a potential down the road that some of this land may have a sort of different future or purpose. And maybe some of the landowners are really seeing that sort of future designation in their ability to develop that land, whatever they want to do with it, their potential to bring resources or revenue off it as having changed. So what does that mean for someone like a community that relies on property taxes as the main source to fund government, to fund education? And what may be some avenues for some of this land to go into conservation ownership that may be different than private? One of them could be town ownership, town forest. They've been around in the state for a long time, or other conservation groups. And how can that land still serve the value to this community, forestry, but yet if it's under public ownership, the public at large, the community is going to expect other uses to also be allowed, whether it's recreation, whether it's, you name it. There's got to be multiple values placed in that land. If it's coming off the property taxpayer rolls and now in the public space, not contributing to the tax base, what does that mean in the future? And I think this is going to play out over the next decade or so. And so obviously municipalities are thinking about what this might mean for their grand list values and their properties. One of the ways that I think it's worked successfully from some of the things I've been involved in is providing recreational opportunities on this forest property. I can think of a particular project on a rather large town forest where the trail organization I was involved with, built some trails in there with the blessing of the Conservation Commission, knowing all along there was a big logging operation coming. And that was, things are going to have to move, things are going to have to change. This is why you have the town forest. It's time for a harvest. And so having those intentional partnerships and those conversations so that people can see their value and see a place to continue to be involved in discussion is first important. Second, I think for folks that are involved in the forest industry, the loggers that are going in there, they need to be brought into that conversation, maybe understand the value proposition on what they're bringing off that land. Maybe needs to be shifted if the communities really benefit some of the recreation that's going to come after them. And how is there an opportunity in there for the loggers, the folks that are actually doing the harvest, to benefit from that? Having a trail planner involved, from the community or from the bike club, mountain bike club at the table. Because what you don't want to have happen, which I've heard in some cases, is the work's done, Conservation Commission or whoever the group isn't happy with the job because the harvester did X, Y, and Z, but the harvester's not to blame. They did their job, If someone else would have had funding to make sure that this trail was maintained or this was done differently afterwards, there's maybe an opportunity in there for the people working the land, doing the harvesting, to get some additional other public sources to ensure that value comes off of that property after it's harvested. And I think if more property potentially is going to shift to some type of public ownership with these multiple values, this is maybe going to come up more and more. And maybe there's smaller parcels that are going to be pieced together for harvest, and just think it's something we need to be thinking about and planning for the future, so we don't have these conflicts, and everyone still has an opportunity to make their living off the land, and the public feels like all activities were valued in that process. So that's one of the things to think about. And now let me bring it to the current job I'm in, because a lot of that really doesn't seem too seamless with Vermont League of Cities and Towns. One of the ironies here is that if you are a private landowner and you welcome the public on your land without charge, just, you don't post it, whether it's hunting or whether you allow walking or mountain bike trails, you have liability protection, landowner liability protection, one of the best in the country. Well, how many people here know that that liability protection is not afforded to municipal forests? It isn't. There's a statute that municipalities aren't protected in the same way if someone was to bring a lawsuit for being injured, and that even applies onto state forests. So there's some work that I think we can do from the municipal level with a coalition like this that are sort of non-traditional, that are all saying this doesn't make sense. If a community forest is trying to serve all these purposes, it's public land, and people recreate there, the municipality shouldn't feel a liability if something goes wrong, out of their hands. And I think that could be a roadblock in the future. And so that's one of the things that I've taken away from looking at this work, knowing this was coming up, is diving into this statute a little bit, trying to understand the background. And it seems that it was, it really wasn't for any particular purpose. It really had to do with a political beef with someone that was upset with some organization working on forestry stuff at the time. And so there's an exemption line for municipal and state forests where private forests have this liability protection. And so, that's sort of where having non-traditional partners come together and all be in their space with the common goal of, we need forest, it has all these different values, and if we have a common set of objectives, we can find a place to all weave it together and work together, so.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Yeah, seeing the scale we're talking at shift from regional to state to parcel level is really, really interesting. And this concept that there might be state policies that don't make sense is brand new to me. But Colleen, I'd be curious, as the panelist up here who's engaged in forest processing, who has to kind of, work within a lot of these policies, what do you see on the landscape right now from where you sit?
I'm glad I'm not in land use planning. I think we all have certain goals that we want to see going forward, and I do believe that we have different ways of getting there. Being an old person involved in a forest business for 50 years, you've seen lots of changes from willy-nilly to yes, guidelines to yes, planning and so forth. But one of the basic things is a strong forest products industry is going to be our best tool in the toolbox for forest fragmentation. That's the basic one. It's also the best tool in the toolbox for climate mitigation. We've had the forest strategic roadmap identifying the importance of a strong and vibrant forest economy, culturally, economically, and also with all the environmental benefits: clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, recreational values, now climate change. So we want to make sure, and our goal has been to, how do we use this natural renewable resource in a sustainable manner to give everyone the benefits that they've enjoyed for many years. We are seeing a decline in sawmills and other facilities that add value to those logs coming out of our forests, with the 80%, 76% of our forested land, mostly private ownership. If those private landowners can realize value of products off their property, they can probably pay their property taxes and all do other enhancements to their property. When they're put between a rock and a hard place, probably are going to be sold, and it's probably going to be in smaller parcels. So that is a concern, and we've seen it. So how do we use our natural resources, our forest economy? How do we grow it? Part of it is regulation, Act 250, and we're happy that it's being looked at. The hours of operation that's a plus. The mitigation is a plus if that goes through one to one. But what we need more facilities, which regulation does play a role in that. Why are businesses being located outside of the state borders? Act 250 revision, simplification. We're not saying there shouldn't be any rules and regulations, but we're saying if an investor wants to come to Vermont and site a mill or some other value-added facility, it shouldn't take years. It's going to take money, time, money, and restrictions, I guess would be the three things. So if we can improve on those, we're probably going to have a better chance of having industry come here. Having a local market for your logs will produce more income for everyone in the supply chain. That goes back to that landowner that needs money to operate on. And we're going to reduce carbon emissions because that facility is going to be near the source of the wood, and it's going to provide employment. A lot of good things that are going on, but I don't know if we're there yet. And hopefully that some of the items identified in the roadmap, I know it's a 10-year process, so I don't know if we've got 10 years or not. I guess I should be optimistic and say maybe. But there are changes in land use. We're all scrutinizing what is the best way to manage property. But I have a concern that a lot of times, because the industry is not always understood, what does it take to have the type of people that want to do that work? Where is our place? And if we analyze and prioritize to the point that parcels of land are not suitable to log, move your equipment in, and have a proper harvest, I'm just wondering, where is our place as we try to make all these different sensitive areas? Does that create a fragmentation of its own? It's just a question, but it's something I'm seeing. Because we are loggers and truckers, we have the expense to even have your machinery, and we're working with Mother Nature. It's no simple thing. Every time you move your equipment, it's a cost. So we just want to make sure that we are addressing the core values of Vermonters, their working lands, which was probably the best thing that I've seen in years. I grew up on a dairy farm, and ag and dairy were always, you heard good things about it. Forestry, you didn't always. And when we were identified as being the core value of Vermonters, we at least got put on the same platform with agriculture, long overdue. And we just want to make sure that the people that are enjoying these benefits, that they can continue to do that in the future, and that we don't do something today that may have consequences that we didn't see down the road. So where is our place?
Yeah. Thanks, Colleen. I think that's a really important kind of context setting, because anytime we have these conversations, they kind of end up at a very high level of, heady conversations about policy. Sometimes we drift away from the nuts and bolts of what they're based on and what it actually means to people doing the work on the ground. So that's why I'm really glad you're on the panel today. So we talked a lot as we went kind of around about a lot of the regulatory things that are happening, but I also want to make sure we keep in the back of our head other non-regulatory things that might be going on, things that might be opportunities there, things we can look at as well. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going and kind of tee up another question, and then what I want to do is kind of open it up to the room to get some thoughts and feedback. But let's move into kind of thinking around best practices. You know, as we look around this landscape of land use planning, policy, regulatory, non-regulatory, can anybody point to things that you're seeing that actually are working well, or that are working, maybe not entirely well, that could be better, but bright spots, things that are what we would consider to be best practices in this area that we can look to as a model? Jamey, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yes, I think about, the role of land use in Vermont and worked with a lot of municipalities, and that, right away people feel like we're talking about regulatory solutions, and that's not necessarily the case. A lot of land use planning can promote non-regulatory solutions such as landowners enrolling in the current use program. Landowners thinking about what's sort of the long-term strategy for their land ownership. Have they thought about different mechanisms that are available to lower the carrying cost of property taxes? Are they aware of tax benefits if they want to pursue conservation on their land? Are they aware of promoting a lot of the stewardship, funds that are available to do good activities on their land, to do forestry and do it well to manage for water quality, for example. And so there's a role that can be played, and what I do want to highlight is one, I think, sort of success story that we've been able to measure is sort of, we referenced Act 171. It was a forest omnibus bill for many years ago. Embedded in that, I think, was the right to practice forestry part of that.
It was
Separate. There were other provisions in there, though, that helped, a number of provisions in there that helped the forest products industry. One of them, though, was to look at the role of land use planning, local municipal planning. So it's now a requirement when you do your town plan to identify important forest blocks. These are important forest areas. And to plan for policies to, one, try and reduce the fragmentation of those areas. And when I talk about fragmentation, at least from my perspective, we're talking about maintaining working forests. We're talking about maintaining functioning forests. And that would be for working forests and then ecological considerations. Then there's a lot of symbiotic relationship there as far as the management we do and maintaining the ecology of areas. So as I talk about sort of fragmentation, I'm thinking very much about the maintenance of working lands. Specifically, when that statute was put into effect, it says that the planning that's done through the town plan, so it's not necessarily regulatory, it's more of a planning process. A plan may include specific policies to encourage the active management of those areas for wildlife habitat, water quality, timber, production, recreation, or other values or functions identified from the municipality. So again, I want to underscore that for anybody who's familiar with this Act 171 sort of planning process that's happening in municipalities, there's a real opportunity, and it should be about trying to promote the value of working forest areas. In 2009, 37% of towns sort of recognized where are these important forest areas in the town. Jumping ahead to after when this provision was passed, 77% of towns have now done this sort of mapping and consideration of forest areas in 2020. So there's just a whole educational process there, just sitting down and identifying where the areas that are important to the municipality and people in the town for forests. And other best practices, I'll just quickly go down a quick list here and then turn it over to share impressions. So the current use program, we've studied and measured that it is quantifiably more successful in maintaining undeveloped forests over time than land that's not enrolled. And so it's working. We all know it's an important program. The enrollment continues to go up. But as far as how we look at subdivision of forest land, sort of decrease the parcel size that's viable for forestry, the land that's enrolled in current use has a much higher rate over time of maintaining. So clearly the current use program from a non-regulatory perspective is really important. And then I would say there's like a lot of things that kind of are like maybe like regulatory, but like the role that select boards are playing in managing road policies, weight limits, like promoting policies in municipalities to be able to move timber, move it during the right time of the year. zoning districts that are forest reserves, for example, where there's usually a minimum lot size to enroll parcels into the current use program. About 25% of municipalities that have zoning in Vermont have those districts. And then I would say more on the regulatory side quickly that 54% of towns have subdivision regulations, and that's where you can actually get into sort of having to say, as subdivision is happening, are you maintaining access to working lands? Have you thought about that? Have you planned ahead for where that access is going to be? Are you designing the lots in a way that's going to maintain functional sort of working lands over time? Are you dividing them into lots that will no longer perform that function anymore or not laid out the right way? 78% of towns that have these regulations have natural resource considerations, but we've done this through sort of analysis through the state. I don't know how much of those standards actually consider impacts to working lands. And I think as an opportunity, maybe we'll get to there's potentially a lot of work that could be done there.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I just want to be clear, one thing that you said was towns thinking about forest reserve areas, and the word reserve has kind of, it's not taken on new meanings, but in different contexts means different things. And I just want to be clear, and what you're talking about, you're saying zoning that would essentially establish minimum lot sizes so that parcels in that area would continue to be eligible for current use.
It's a forest district, let's say. It's a district that really has front and center the goal of, maintaining working forests, for example, or being functional as maintaining the integrity of forests.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the reserve, that's not to be confused with.
Yeah, the reserve
Ecological
category in
reserves,
UVA or something, yeah. Yeah, and the access thing is so important because I'm sure that all of us have looked at maps before where the core of the forest you want to get to is here, but it's a real challenge in terms of how do you get it through this individual parcel? Is it a separate parcel? And then even zooming in, there's been multiple times where I've gone to an individual parcel level and where'd they build the sugar house? Right on the log land. So thinking about planning for access at multiple scales is it's super important to think about proactively. So Catherine, as with your RPC hat on, as the body that works with towns around local planning, what do you see here?
Very similar to what Jamie mentioned, I see an increased awareness of the importance of maintaining working forests within a community. And that takes many different fronts, approaches depending upon the community that you're serving. And one is the idea of making sure that the important areas where you have forests in your town are regulated at the local level in such a way that continues that forest in a healthy way to support the forest products industry. And one great example I can give you, a town in our region, Edithsburg, had a provision that I helped them write. It was a long time ago, it was about 15 years ago, so it was even before they had to pay attention to this, but we had the benefit of Nancy Patch as being part of the community. And they have a whole additional review process that you have to go through in these places where there's this forest block that needs to be maintained. It doesn't say you can't develop, but it says if you're going to develop here, you have to do it in such a way that maintains the integrity of that forest so that it can continue to be actively used for forest purposes. And that was a big step, and it was a big deal for the community to take that on and to do it at the local level, something that was normally looked at the state level or higher. So I was really pleased to see the community do that, and that's one great example of, I think, where it's working well and something that can be replicated. And then the other thing is that the conversation has really changed. So when I first started in planning, and I would be talking to communities about future plans, when forestry was talked about, it was talked about, oh yeah, I know so-and-so works in the woods, and so they work up there, and that's what you heard. You didn't hear the importance of forestry talked about in terms of climate resilience, in terms of flood resilience, in terms of maintaining water quality, in terms of the local economy, the state economy, the regional economy. And so that conversation has really shifted and I think elevated the importance of the industry, because the more partners saying the same thing that you say, it's going to really make a difference in the long run. And I've really seen a shift in those conversations locally.
Yeah, that's great. Josh, thinking about the local level, right? Because a lot of what we're talking about right now is focusing on local planning. So it's the community coming together, setting a vision, thinking about, town plans or zoning bylaws if it's a community with zoning. And so, sitting on the VLCT board, which I have the pleasure to do, a lot of times we think about local control, right? We want to make sure the local community is setting the direction here. And so I'm wondering, from that perspective, what do you see developing here as far as opportunities for towns?
Yeah, I was thinking about this now, make a sports analogy here, like best offense is a defense or best defense is offense, depending which side you're coming at this from. Because, let's be real, like one of the pressures on the property in the forest land is housing, right? We need more housing, and it's been easier to avoid some of the Act 250 and some of the regulatory challenges to buy a piece of property and develop 9 houses over time, rather than build the 20 that this, community could accommodate in a short period of time as needed. And there's been a lot of evolution over the last 5 years around the importance of providing easy development pathways for housing in our already built environments. And in my view, that one of the goals should be to take the pressure off of those other options of fragmenting forests. And the easy path to do the housing that doesn't impact this resource is a good defense to the work that you're all trying to do, for starters. And so communities that can embrace that effort of welcoming the density, welcoming the infill, and the sort of making your zoning bylaws easy for different uses and compatible uses that maybe, have this district is just this density housing and just this commercial and just this retail, like merge those together. They all live, they're in the same ecosystem, right? That's where all the humans are trying to get what they need, work and sleep. And then your other ecosystem is your working lands, and they have a different need. And so be flexible, for starters, is the thing I think about the most. On just a real micro example, I live near Braintree. And there's the Braintree Forest, there's lots of privately owned forest land and various different ownership models. And, about 10 years ago, there was this big effort with a very large landowner, almost 2,000 acres. People in this new room probably know more about some of the details, but he was always in current use and, big forest, but he was looking to donate it, lifetime, and he worked with the New England Forestry Foundation to donate it, but there was a pretty big conversation with the local recreation club. At the time it was Rasta, now it's Ridgeline, and the town, saying, hey, this is all going on. I don't want to hurt the economic future of the town. I want to support it, but I want to conserve this land. And it's going to have active forestry. So how can we accommodate this together? And it worked out really well with the trail club, built all these glading trails, and walked the area, mapped it with the forester. Yep, this is the species and used literally armies of volunteers to do some of the low-level forestry work, plan the parking lot so it didn't interfere with where there's going to be future log landings needed, and work with the town so there wasn't conflicts on the town road and the parking and the snow crew, the plowing crew to move and it was a fine dance of doing that, but that landowner, the town, and the sort of folks that had become accustomed to using that property work together with some mutual goals, again, to get that done. And I just think that speaks to talking with each other and thinking outside of your normal circles of who you maybe just do this work with, from all parties.
Yeah, getting that collective buy-in, collective support to move something forward. Colleen, I'm curious, 50 years with the mill, I imagine that over time, you've had wood come in from the same property maybe multiple times, or from similar landowners and, the land base that feeds your enterprise. Over that time period, have you seen things that have worked well as far as maintaining that land base? Conversely, things that might not have worked well, but what have you seen over that time frame?
Well, our mill procures logs from within about a 75-mile radius, so we're very local. We're all actually part of the same family. If you go back, we're all related anyway. But
Northern Vermont.
Just being able to provide that market to help sustain that farm landowner or whatever, has been important. We are seeing different people coming into the area, especially since the pandemic. We're seeing new landowners. I would say in the last 5 years, we're seeing a lot more of a change in land ownership than we had in 30 years prior. So each one of those landowners has a different view of what they've purchased. There's trees on it. There may have different ideas of what those trees are for. Where it used to be part of a farm and harvested every cycle, it may change. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing the need to provide education to those new landowners of options for planning.
Yeah.
So we are seeing a change in land ownership.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because a lot of times these efforts, we think about planning nuts and bolts on the land, subdivisions, layout, development, but the people making those decisions at their kitchen table are so critical to how this gets done, right? So I think you raise a really interesting point around landowner transitions, what does the land-based land ownership look like, and the challenges and maybe opportunities that come with that, you know? So that's something that I wanna definitely dig into a little bit more. I wanna kind of pause for 1 second, and just how many people in this room serve on a local municipal body? Okay, 2, all right. Are either of them a planning commission?
I used to be on the planning commission.
Yeah,
No, the housing authority.
housing authority? What about you, Odie?
I chair the development review board.
DRB, is that
I'm a tree warden and the lumber inspector.
He's also the wearer of coal, inspector of shingles, yeah.
That's weird.
All that
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, one thing that stands out to me is that the more people that are involved in this work that can be in those rooms and get on those boards, the better we're gonna be. Because if this thought process isn't part of the bigger process, it's not gonna show up there. We've seen it at the legislative level, but we see it at the local level as well. So we've covered a lot of ground in the last 40 minutes or so, and I just want to kind of open it up to the room for a minute, just to hear any kind of reflection on what we've talked about, things that you might have missed, you know, in terms of situational context or opportunities or things that you've seen work well or not in your communities. Yeah, Woody, go ahead.
It's a complicated thing, but I'll try to make it quick to not co-opt all the time. All these efforts are interesting and beneficial. One of the things I see lost recently is that the working lands, working forests don't stand alone. You really can't make enough money from logging anymore to pay your taxes. Haven't been able for a long time. Our legal tax structure taxes your land based on its development value. Even if you conserve it, it's based on its development value. You don't save money by conserving your land. It still gets taxed at the same rate, pretty much, unless you're really good and have an attorney. So we have this issue where it really isn't sustainable to a certain extent. One of the elements in all of this more modern planning is let's protect the blocks of land, let's protect the working forests. I work with, as a consulting forester, with many private landowners, medium and large sized landowners. All of them want to conserve their land, all want to do the right thing. But they also might want to build a house for their daughter. And there's some of them are going to wake up with a new Act 250 thing, Tier 3, and they aren't going to be able to do that unless they go through Act 250. Theoretically, we don't know that process yet. But taking away the value, when we think we're adding value and saying we're protecting your land for its working forest value, isn't necessarily a good thing. We need to protect the full suite of values for landowners through these planning, incentive, and even regulatory processes. And having a large landowner with 500 acres, they need places to live in those rural communities too. So having a provision within the planning process or regulatory process that allows for that person to develop a certain amount of their land. It's the model the land trust uses. When they go to serve a property, they say, you want to keep 10 acres out for your children. It's done. It's not thought of in the top-down statewide regulatory planning process. That's an issue you need to deal with.
Yeah, and as Catherine pointed out too, you know, there are opportunities in state, but also local planning where we've said, maybe necessarily, I mean, to your point, if we map completely sensitive stay out areas, that's end of story, period. But there's areas where we talk more about, it's not that you can't develop here, it's if you do develop here, here are the considerations we want to think about. Yeah, so to your point, I think the process is the important thing. Opportunity, ease of process, efficiency, cost, again, is really important. Yeah. Yeah, good.
And thank you. For the record, Jed Lipsky, I'm a logger. And to Charlie's question earlier, I probably have 61 man-years in municipal offices, including school boards and select boards and planning boards and regional. But I'm not in that role now. But as a member of the House Agriculture, Food Resilience and Forestry Committee, I have been a very vocal advocate for the working lands. And to Jonathan Wood's question or point, I also serve on the Rural Caucus, which was a very strong advocate group, tripartisan for the working lands in rural Vermont. And one of the points that we made in communicating the policy that was important, just like farm families, when there were a lot of little farms as the generations went on, now there's this consolidation. There are large farms owned by multiple generations of family, and the ability for succession transition for the dairy industry in particular in Franklin County, it's a big issue, and that's taken into consideration. And we brought that up in the Rural Caucus for forest landowners. We'd like our kids or our grandkids to be able to stay working land in the state they love, and that the current bill 687 does not. It's a mandatory trip of Act 250 regulation in those areas. We also had testimony from small sawmills in our committee, from firewood producers and compost or mulch producers that came in, testified of how burdensome tripping Act 250 was. In a small sawmill in Fletcher, it cost them over $75,000, making it, had they known, and had they not ahead of time, even though it was family land, they wouldn't have gone through the hurdle. So it is a major roadblock when these triggers are triggered to what Colleen has been able to do. It's now multi-generational forest product producer. It's getting harder and harder. And if we care about these rural communities, we also suggested to put a cap for smaller sawmills, firewood producers, or chip storage or compost, to have them exempted from Act 250. So these are discussions that got waylaid, and as Jamey rightfully pointed out, there is going to be a study committee that may try to address these issues, but there is a segment, it's not this high majority of the legislature wants to make sure the working lands can remain working, can remain productive, but we need to keep bending over backwards. Final thing, and it will take more time, the carbon market challenge. I've walked lands where all of a sudden there's 6,800 acres or 8,000 acres that had been in forest management families for generations. Now they've opted out, where there's only hunting for a few people by permission. There's no cutting of trees for 100 years. This is a huge threat to what Colleen's future generation is going to face, is access to stumpage. Another example is FPR has really drawn back. There used to be 15 or 20 timber sales. Now they're almost none, 1 or 2 a year maybe. And on municipal forests, I appreciated the League of City and Towns. We had a wind event in 2017 that knocked over vast portions of Katy Hill Forest, mountain bike mecca in our community of Stowe. There never would have been a tree cut, but all of a sudden, 100% of the mountain bike trail system, hiking trails was wiped out. We went in on the northern end, Orleans, Barton outfit came in on the southern end and salvaged and restored within a year, the entire mountain bike economy and complex was up and running. But without that severe wind event, there would have been no trees cut. So we have a lot of challenges, and I think this coalition of stakeholders is important. I'm active on the implementation along with Scott. We're in different segments of the Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. I know Colleen is a leader there. It's very important for that we're working together organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I think you point out a couple interesting things there that stand out to me. One is this idea of regulatory versus non-regulatory, right? Succession planning with forest landowners, that's non-regulatory, but it's super important. Then you look at things that are more market-driven, like carbon markets. Non-regulatory, drifting into regulatory, depending on the marketplace, and that's certainly another thing to kind of put on the table. That's what we're doing here today, is just putting it on the table, right? So great to point out. And then I do want to highlight, as you mentioned, as Jamey mentioned, this study that might come out should this 687 pass. On the face of it, there was a little bit of like oh man, we didn't get the exemption that we wanted, right? But at least maybe optimistic, looking at it as a bright spot to kind of get your foot in the door to a broader conversation around permitting. Perhaps this is an opportunity to go back and say, it's not just Act 250. It's how do we integrate stormwater permitting? How do we integrate these other things? So I just want to kind of highlight the opportunity that we might have there. And again, I go back to that importance of showing up and being part of that conversation that we all need to do. Yeah. Yes.
I have been owner of almost 200 acres of land for, it's now 1 year short of 60 years. And over that time, I've come to the conclusion that in the Vermont scheme of things, the landowner is at the very bottom of a government pyramid. And nobody pays any attention to the landowner. Plans are made, no notification is ever made to them. I learned about it through notices in the newspaper. I can't go to 20 meetings a month to figure out who's going to do what to me. I just can't do it. Recently, I had a neighbor who wished to acquire the woodland portion of my property to develop into a sugar place. And Act 250 is not the problem. The big impediment in my case is Act 249, which was passed 6 days prior to Act 250. And that's septic regulations. And I wound up, if I were to have gone through with the sale, which I ultimately decided I couldn't do for a different reason, but if I had gone through it, I would have had to exclude 20 acres from the sale because I had my existing septic system is grandfathered. Consequently, I have no septic plan. Without a septic plan, if I don't have 20 acres, I can't guarantee that I would have space for it. So I would have been in the situation of selling my neighbor my property and then negotiating with him maybe in a few years to get property back for a septic system. And there's a shortage of surveyors in this state, and it took me almost a year to get a survey done. And I seem not to be able to find a lawyer who's willing to do work, so I had a 9-month delay getting a proposed contract ratified. But the real impediment was that I've owned the land for 60 years. And if I took the house and improvements off of the property, 98% of what I would have received for the property was capital gain. I couldn't do it. I just plain couldn't do it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think the more we talk about this, the more I think we all realize the complexity of everything being hitched to everything else, whether it's wastewater or tax policy or, all the things we're talking about, it's all connected. And so, as we said from the get-go, there's no simple solution today that we're gonna put forward or pitch or walk out of here with. Seth, and then we'll turn it back to the panel.
Okay, well, I was just gonna point out, that sort of along what everybody else has been saying, it's sort of obvious, but for us that sit in this room, Colleen mentioned earlier that one of the greatest conservation efforts that we have in the state is a vibrant forest economy. And for the bulk of the citizenry in the state, they don't understand that. It seems contradictory to sort of logic, that we manage our forest to protect our forest. And that is a subject of the fact that more and more of our citizens in the state are more and more urbanized, further and further away from the natural environment. Other than going out, we love to go experience it. They've lost the perspective of the fact that forests are ever changing. They all want to keep it the way it is today, but we all know that even if we preserve it, it's not going to stay the way it is today. And I think that's a big part of it, and getting together with diverse groups from and having these discussions, and I wish we could find those common little nuggets to get the importance of that out there, and the VNRCs and the Audubons and the Forest Products Association, to put that all into context for people, to help the policymakers most importantly, but also the citizenry at large, to start to appreciate that some of the things that they want to protect the most, some of the things that they're advocating for, locking up forests, not actively managing them anymore, could be more detrimental than would be detrimental, and they just don't understand that. And I think that's important to get groups together like this to have the discussions.
Yeah, another pillar of the roadmap, I don't have the exact language in front of me, but it's essentially, we gotta tell our story better. Because telling the story better is gonna bring in advocates to our cause, for lack of a better word. So I completely agree with you. So I've got a couple other questions that I kind of want to tee up, but I also want to just give the panel a minute to, we've talked about a lot. Anything that you guys have heard that you want to reflect on? Jamey, go
One
ahead.
quick thing, and it goes to understandable agita maybe about how sort of that tier 3 critical resource area may work. It's left very open-ended at this moment to sort of go through stakeholder process and sort of a rulemaking process. And I do want to highlight, it's really important to look at the language, because it's interesting. It doesn't say automatic Act 250 jurisdiction. It says determine how jurisdiction would work in these areas that are identified. Determine if it is Act 250, how would jurisdiction work? And so I think to your point, traditionally Act 250 has not triggered a 1 or 2 lot subdivision if you want to have your child or children live on your property. It's been, minimum 6 lots or 10 lots. So this may be the first time where there's sort of like you're raising the threshold. I think considerations like you raised would be an important part of the conversation. Like maybe the jurisdiction shouldn't trigger if you're creating a lot for a child, or maybe there should be a buffer area to allow for a certain amount of development that you may want to. So I think there's a lot of flexibility in how that conversation may happen. And it also highlights, are there other sort of programs or policies that could address, getting at the important conservation of these sort of the heightened critical resource areas that will be identified. So I just wanted to put that on the table, recognizing that there is going to be obvious concern about how that plays out, and it needs to be workable.
Yeah, I think the really important point that I take away from what you said is that a lot of this is not baked. The next step is rulemaking. The next step is getting to how do we do it. And so probably sounds like a broken record, but our industry needs to show up and be in the room and be part of that conversation. So, yeah.
I was just going to respond to the importance of the rural caucus in this conversation, having that tripartisan, having a whole bunch of small towns from across the state saying, hold on, we all have a little bit different political perspective, but we have these rural needs to keep us vibrant. We need a space at the table, we need a space to live, we need these. And to the point about the big land conservation pieces, where, the 30 by 30, 50 by 50 effort, I was on a facilitated discussion from VHCB and the groups that are doing it. And, one of the points that I brought up pretty strongly, because it's great that we can count parcels and we're reaching this goal, but how are we getting the parcels? Is it just the big landlords just saying, yep, here, and then they get to control what the use is? That's not a public input process. We're just counting up acreage and saying, goal met. Who has a public voice in that land that's being counted as meeting this goal? It's not like it's all public land. It's private land saying, yep, we've met the goal, and it could be, don't touch it, you can never come here again. And that is bumping up against the goals of this group. And so I think that is a process that this industry should pay attention to. Because when we start to meet these goals of certain levels of land conserved, by whom, for what purpose, who donated, who's controlling it, is a question, because it's not meeting everyone's goals of why we're conserving that land. And I think everyone needs a seat at the table if we're gonna count it as publicly conserved land.
Yeah, and to your broader point, 80% of the state's forested, 80% of that, give or take, is in private family ownerships. And so it's really important. Catherine, did you have?
I have two things that I took away from this conversation. One is that there is, to the point about people who are, people getting more urbanized in Vermont, people moving here from away, not recognizing the value of forestry and a well-managed forest. Because you go out in rural areas and you see an open field, you understand automatically it's beautiful because it's farmed. When you look at a forest, you don't understand that it is so beautiful, it is available to you for recreation, because it has been part of active forestry use. It's been well managed. And so telling that story is, I think, crucially important, because that leads very closely to my second point, which is agriculture has done a really good job of solidifying in law the right to farm, and very expansive right to farm laws. And I think there's a real opportunity to expand in the area of the forest products industry and forestry, in those, to be codified in law, more right to do what you need to do for a healthy economic industry.
Yeah, well put. I know that we have as Jamey mentioned earlier, the right to practice forestry, it's the right wording, was passed a number of years ago. I don't know off the top of my head, Woody, you might know, or Jamey, are there guardrails on that? And if so, what are they?
Do you want to recall?
Ed might know more than I.
Or Ed, yeah, of course, Ed.
There are some guardrails. There's a local zoning piece that could infringe upon your right. Also, there's a bit of a traditional use piece in there that is kind of tricky to interpret, and it's going to have to be tested someday or along through the judiciary. If you build a firewood operation in a neighborhood, homes, even though you're on a piece of land that has been agriculture forever, you may be you may be bumping up against that guardrail. So far, it's been working all right, but that is one piece that we're kind of concerned about. But yes, about 5-6 years ago, we did adopt a right to forestry law, very similar to the agriculture right. But there is a little bit of there's a standard in there
That standard is the reason that that's not a fully viable protection is that it has to be a pre-existing condition. So you basically have to add a forestry operation. They can't come into Colleen and say, you're not a sawmill anymore. But if somebody wanted to build a sawmill in a new place, no protection, because it has to be a pre-existing use that existed prior to enactment.
also, it has to be mobile. It has to be equipment that you can move.
And I guess my point is, I don't know of any other industry in the state of Vermont where the legislature talks about hours of operation and what should be a standard for when regulation takes place or doesn't. I can't think of a single other industry that's talked about in that way at the legislature.
Well, but they're not dragging wood out of the forestry.
But there's plenty other industries that are loud, that are smelly, that have impacts on neighborhoods, but they're not talked about and managed in that sort of micro level. And that's where I think there's some opportunity with this study to think about the industry in a more global way and get out of that micromanagement.
And the other provision that I forgot, which I'm now reminded, in the omnibus that had the Act 170, well, it was Act 171, I think it was the same year as the right to practice forestry. It was a pretty big year for forest industry issues. There was a clarification that municipalities cannot regulate forestry, and that's in statute. And there was attempts, at times it was happening, there were attempts.
Still is.
Still is, probably, yeah.
It's illegal, but it's still happening.
Anyways, that's on the books, and I think that is a good recognition that the legislature, made not to, to try and, right, recognize that there can't be overreach.
We've always had that protection, but they clarified it. But it's still not working.
There are various workarounds that are used. When the Lowell Wind Project was approved, it was approved with a mitigation. And the mitigation required that the offsetting lands be, have forestry excluded. And so 4,400 acres in the town of Eden was bought at 3 times the going market rate of forest land and conserved forever wild with one activity allowed, maple syrup. And nobody in town ever discussed this, nobody in town wanted it, no one in town was consulted. It was a deal between somebody at the state level and a partnership based in Montreal. Because it's a partnership, there are no public records of their financial statements.
Bruce, I think your point, to me at least, highlights something that Catherine had brought up earlier around local and regional planning and how much weight a lot of that can carry. Because, I wonder if Lowell or Eden had a town plan in place that said very specifically, like, these areas are super important to us as working force, like, could that be an option? And so,
Yeah, except the problem, and you probably don't remember all of the fracas around Act 200, which is many years ago now. But it required towns to install an interim zoning. So whoever set up the interim zoning in Eden, if they had planned to torpedo town plans, they couldn't have done better. They put 18,000 acres of Eden in 50-acre zoning. Well, you didn't want to be an advocate of that at town meeting. The vote was 144-2.
interesting. So I do want to, we only have about 15, 20 minutes left. I just want to kind of pull way back and think about opportunities that our panelists kind of see on the horizon. And perhaps it's things we've already touched on, and we can reiterate them, or new things. But as you look at the horizon and we think about this industry, the land use planning and what's coming, and where the opportunities are there other opportunities that you see, bright spots, things that this industry can look to kind of be there to pull the right lever, to influence the right direction on things? So I'll open it up to, there's gotta be some, come on, guys.
Well, I said two already earlier that I think are important, is the opportunity to educate people about what they see when they look out the window.
Yep.
And to really look at achieving more parity with agriculture
Yep.
for some of the regulatory changes.
Yeah,
This is kind of, wacky, but it just dawned on me, my previous job, was getting a lot of folks coming in because needing to build housing, their housing shortage, like new and innovative ways to build with wood, to meet our housing demand, having some prefabricated facilities that put, timber frame together, that use, waste wood in a different way. I think, the industry is moving really fast for efficiency and for cost. And wood is used to build homes primarily, but don't take that for granted forever. There are people trying to integrate new products and things to do it quicker, cheaper, without wood. And I think that the industry and sort of the innovation needs to be right there to try to keep wood products used in building our homes, or someone's going to find that space. And I think it's just important to keep that innovation mindset in this industry alive.
And that's difficult. Hundreds of deeds
Yeah.
on file in town offices have a prohibition on the sale, and these are unenforceable, but they're there, and a lot of people respect it, against manufactured housing. This property may not be used for manufactured housing, and people will sign the deed, and then they are reluctant to then have to go to court to break that.
A lot of that's being preempted in some of these zoning reforms that are happening now, and the right to do an ADU or duplex or what have you. But there was several presentations I received from folks that weren't from Vermont, that wanted to set up a shop here to build housing, and they looked at our woodshed of the whole area, and they were struggling to find a facility, worried about Act 250, worried about financing, worried about workforce. But the point is, like, wood is a core building project to meet our housing crisis, needs to stay right there with the innovation that's happening from every other sort of industry in this space.
Yeah. What an interesting thing too, to think about when some of those were written, what manufactured housing meant.
Right.
When that was actually put on paper, and what manufactured housing might mean now, today. So Colleen, I'm curious, from where you sit,
Where do
the
I
Sun
sit?
Belt,
Well,
what do you see as opportunities out there, things that you look to as potential bright spots?
She manufactures houses.
Yeah, there you go. More than just houses.
I would say, continue to tell our story. I know, support your industry groups, Vermont Woodlands, Woodworks Council, Vermont Forest Products Association, see what activities we can do together to have a stronger voice. And we need to be at the table for these discussions on policy. And sometimes the groups are already chosen, and it might not be a good balance. So I really need to stress that when these committees are set up, that we do have balance and have the best opportunity for communication and hopefully have good outcomes.
Yep.
Because this industry is too important to let it slide off the side of the hill.
Yep.
And we're kind of sliding, but I think with some, the strategic roadmap and some realization, we haven't gone out over the edge yet, but we are under pressure just because of challenging business to be in.
Yep. Yeah, well said. Jamey, where do you see opportunities on the horizon?
So I'm going to reflect on the past year and where I saw a lot of coordination. We've been talking about the need to coordinate and work together. And before I say that, I want to color it with a challenge, because I think it's related. And I think we've talked about it here. And I'll back into the opportunity. We created a tracking tool to just basically measure land use classification change in Vermont based on subdivision and what's happening. And forest land is what we're losing at the fastest rate than any other land use classification that we have. So from 2005 to 2020, 19% of what was considered to be undeveloped forest land changed. It either went into residential. Doesn't mean the forest is gone, it just means the use has changed. And those forests still may be working forests, they may be enrolled in current use. So I'm not saying this is a scare tactic. I'm just saying there is a lot of change happening, and change is coming. And how quickly, we'll have to see. But, you know, the real estate transfers are way up. There's a lot of real estate activity, and we're dealing with really high land values. And so the ability to sort of hold on to forest land for forestry, you said it, it's hard, right? And so my concern at least I'll share, is that there'll be too much sort of resorting to subdivision in the places that don't really make the most sense or that'll impact our ability to maintain sort of our rural economy versus doing it in the right areas, the housing efforts that are underway. So now I'm going to transition into the past year. In the 22 years I've been working in Vermont and on policy and legislative policy, I don't think I've ever seen sort of a more roll up your sleeves sort of effort among a lot of stakeholders coming together, from the Chamber of Commerce to the NRC to folks in the administration, Charlie on behalf of Working Lands Interest, and the list goes on of people came together, worked through a summer study, they came up with a number of recommendations, and and stuck to it and trying to inform it. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I think in Vermont, we do have the ability to work together. And we focus on these division lines a lot and the narratives that are out there about a divided public and their views about forestry. And I think that there's a lot of groups, including VNRC, that have for many years bought into the fact that we need to work together and leverage where there's a lot of common ground. So I'd say not letting sort of these division narratives get the best of it, but continue to focus on sort of the shared interests that we have. And there's a lot of other groups that I work with in the conservation community that strongly believe in the value, viable, maintaining working forests, viable forests. So we need to continue to promote those efforts. There's a lot of opportunity there. If some of this legislation passes, there's a lot of opportunity to work together to tackle these challenges.
Yeah, I think your point about coalitions coming together, working together, finding consensus, and then sticking together is super important. It was interesting to see so the work of the summer study committee that came out with a relatively short recommendation on how to change Act 250, the area designation study, things like that. It was a diverse group of partners that typically can be at odds together, but put forward this shared vision. And then when it hit the legislature, as often happens, it went in about 16 other directions. But that coalition stuck together, and every time they came back and said, like, well, what about this? They said, well, no, we already gave you the answer. It's right there in that report. And at the end of the day, that report ended up being the bones of what was passed. There's a lot of other stuff in there too, but so yeah, I agree. I think that coalitions coming together and sticking together is powerful to affect change.
May I address a question to Jamey?
Yes, go ahead.
I've always been troubled by the statistic. I've worked as lister for on and off nearly 30 years. And a purely technical issue in the computer program that we use to make our reports to the state, forest land has a category number 700. And then a house located on a lot larger than 2 acres is category 200. And my impression is that in many towns, if somebody built a house on a 1,000-acre woodlot, it would get changed from category 700 to category 200, which makes it appear that 1,000 acres of woodland has been lost.
And that's why I was really careful to say that it doesn't mean the forest is gone, it doesn't mean it's not working forest, it means there is at least a dwelling there where it needs to be considered some different classification that's more towards a residential, and it is misleading in that sense. And in the reports we put out, we try and clarify this. So yes, your point's really well taken, and I think
we need to improve the way in which listers report the categories, because I think it hasn't been changed for 100 years.
Yeah, and I'm oversimplifying some of the data. You can go to the VNRC website and read our executive summary or look at your town. We have a whole tool where you can look at the data.
Yeah.
But there's other data in there that's showing that we're also seeing like parcels that are 50 acres or larger are declining at the same time. And that's a measure of losing larger parcels.
Yeah.
And so, right, we need to look at a number of these different metrics to kind of then get the picture that we are losing our larger parcels over time. And then as a house goes in over time, we can probably guess there'll continue to be more and more infrastructure on that parcel. Maybe not, but it certainly opens the door.
Yeah, and one of the other, again, going back to the roadmap, one of the recommendations in there is around data. What data do we have? How are we using it? How good is it? And that's looking at everything from parcelization and development to forest health. So, I think that subject of data is incredibly important to this conversation. Yeah. Do you want to jump in?
I do. I wanted to make a point about a point Jamey made earlier on. The use value appraisal program, current use, is the best tool we have for bringing the landowner to the table in forest management. And it's an opportunity for our consulting foresters to have that conversation about how important it is to manage and reach goals and things like that. Jamey said that that's a non-regulatory piece of the pie. Well, it originally was intended to be that. You don't have to enroll, you can volunteer to enroll. But there are a lot of restrictions that go with enrollment. There's required criteria you have to meet to be eligible. You have to maintain that eligibility. The foresters are being changed, we are seeing standards change just about every decade, more than once sometimes, which is increasing the cost of our work and the cost of the land. It's becoming more regulatory every time the legislature meets. So to be positive, I would love to see that program exist and live and not be regulatory. So, but we continue to see, we got 2 million acres of forest land. What an opportunity for regulators to come up with a regulation and control that. And that's my big.
Yeah,
I'm talking to landowners now more than ever who are wanting to transition out. I never had that conversation 20 years ago.
Yeah, and related, I was quick to say, Woody and I were talking about this. I have fears with, the property tax sort of crisis we're in, that the program's gonna be looked at again. Somebody will say 3-year moratorium, or we can't, change the formula. And so, the current East Tax Coalition used to meet, and, anyway, it could be pressure for sure in that regard.
Charlie, I want to add a nugget to that too. So current use, I've been writing current use plans for almost since its inception. And in Wyndham and Windsor County, I have at least 250 clients. I get very few withdrawals from the program. We get withdrawals where people have sold the property and is re-enrolled, but I don't have changing use from forest land to them. And the thing is, we have a very active forest management business with that current use land, so people see this activity work. And when they see jobs get done and they receive funding for it, they're like, wow, that's great, that didn't hurt at all. And then they love it when I come back 15 years later, do it again. I've done timber sales for some clients 4 or 5 times on the same piece, and they're huge advocates for it. I also have a lot of clients that are adding to their land base. They're buying smaller parcels and putting that into it. That doesn't show up in the data.
got a couple minutes left. Anybody have any burning thoughts or light bulb moments from today's conversation they want to share or things they want to ask?
Let's go cut down some trees.
Well, this has been great. Like I said at the get-go, the point today wasn't to come in and transfer a bunch of knowledge to an audience. It wasn't to walk away with a solution or some, oh, this is it, we solved the problem. It was really to start a conversation. And the advisory committee that's going to be working with the department to kind of think about, what do we do next with this roadmap? This topic of land use planning is one of the top 3 things that have been elevated to work on. So, today's conversation, there was a whole lot that came up. We do have the recording that we can go back to and kind of tease out these themes. I think that'll be really valuable for this advisory committee as we think about next steps. And so I guess if I can just leave you with one parting thought to help the broken record. As these things happen, whether it's the rulemaking around potentially changes to Act 250, or it's your own town going through zoning revisions, like my town of Montgomery is going to do this year, show up and be at the table, because unless we've got, foresters, sawmill owners, even the recreation community, at the table, part of the DRB, part of the planning commission, on the select board, we're not going to see that change. So hopefully, can get involved and we can affect the change we want to see. Well, thanks, everybody.
One more thing
yes.
that might be addressed, if there was ever a friendly committee in the legislature to do this, regarding current use. Large conservation landowners have 0 incentive to grieve the value of their property.
Right.
And I'm aware of about a 4,000 acre parcel in Eden, which includes nearly 200 acres of seasonal beaver pond. And no matter what use you think is properly assigned to that land, it should not be on the so-called land schedule at $1,500 an acre.
Yes.
And I mentioned it to the owner of record, and they said, well, that's a lot of work and we get nothing out of it.
Because it's already in, yeah.
It's already set, nobody questions it, it just rolls through, except that increases the reimbursement from the education fund and makes that much fewer dollars available to the rest of the state.
Yep, and as Jamie said, you know, as our pocketbooks get squeezed at a state level, they're gonna start looking at every place they can to pinch pennies.
Yeah.
Current use is one of them, so,
$60 million.
yeah.
Why?
Yep. Great, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. It's funny we met.
Thanks, guys.
Walking in.